director of the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State. Bill, I bet you did some of your education in this room.
I did.
That's right.
Law school. That's right.
His education is a combination of CSU and CU Law, and he got a degree here and went on in various levels of government service. But the thing I want to talk about is especially is when he was governor, the state of Colorado really did some very prescient things, and they did some things that were tough, and but they have served the state well, and it really served the center. It was kind of the basis for the national new energy economy move that the administration now uses. As a matter of fact, Bill claimed it was stolen from him, right? Anyway, he's here to talk about Colorado and the whole notion of the new energy economy and things they've done. Bill now spends a lot of his time working with governors around the country, trying to help them understand how we can do some new things and how state governments can make a difference. So with that, I'll let Bill take the start.
Thanks. Thank you, Mike. So good afternoon. I apologize, first of all, for being late. I thought I'd left myself enough time to get from Fort Collins to Boulder, and there was a terrific rainstorm as I got off of I-25, and traffic slowed to a stop in a couple of places, and so I just was patient about it and got here when I could. What I'd like to do today is, as Mike suggested, tell you a little bit about the Colorado story of what we call the new energy economy, and then really have a dialogue, open it up to questions about this issue from a policy perspective. So it's about more than Colorado, because at the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, what we're doing is actually working with state governments on a variety of different clean energy policy measures. And really that has to do with our vision that there's a great deal that can be done at the state level to address energy issues and to marry those energy policy initiatives with environmental concerns, with public health concerns, and so things that we'd like to see happen at the national level from my perspective. I'll say we, not mean me, but what I would like to see happen at the national level, it's frustrating in a sense that almost nothing is happening at the national level with respect to the development of energy policy, certainly with respect to the development of a clean energy agenda, and certainly with respect to the development of a national policy that hinges on environmental and climate concerns. So our premise at the Center for the New Energy Economy is that while that conversation is stalemated, we can do a variety of really important things at the state level. And part of this is based on our experience in Colorado while I was governor, but also it's based on looking at other states around the country and understanding a great deal is going on at the state level. Quite frankly, a great deal is happening at the municipal and local level, and that while the ideal world for us would be for us to have a national energy policy and a national environmental and climate policy that are sort of married together, as long as that's not happening, the optimum thing's not happening, so what's the thing we can do to still address this issue in a very serious way? So, when I was campaigning for governor, as a candidate for governor, I had been a public prosecutor, both the elected district attorney of Denver, been a federal prosecutor and a state prosecutor, and had not been involved, quite frankly, in energy issues prior to the time that I became a candidate for governor. I was running for about 18 months, and we really developed a sense that it was important for us as a state, as Colorado as a state, to just set a marker about what could be done by states and what would be helpful in Colorado, and that was to establish energy policy based upon sort of 4 different value principles. Actually, we started with 3, and I added a 4th as a candidate. And there's a mnemonic device here. They all begin with E, so that they're easy to remember. But first of all, we said, listen, we look at our resource plans, and we have this level of energy provided by coal-based resources. This was gas. This was renewables. We said, we can change our energy resources and ensure greater use of domestic resources, quite frankly, the ones that are particularly underutilized, And for us, that had a lot to do with renewable resources and natural gas. We're going to talk about natural gas by itself in a little while, but particularly as it related to renewable resources, we were really struck by how little we as a state had in the way of renewable resources and how much we had in the way of the resource. 9th windiest state in the country, 6th sunniest state. The San Luis Valley is one of the sunniest places in the United States of America, and yet we had very little incentive to build out renewable resources, and so that was a part of it. So we said we're going to develop this new energy economy that actually allows us to expand on our domestic energy resources. First E is energy. The second E was, and at the same time, answer environmental challenges. So it wasn't just about homegrown energy, it was about the fact that we could look at environmental challenges, including climate challenges, and change our energy portfolio in a way that was cleaner. So it was about clean energy, it wasn't just about domestic. But we believed at the time that you could also look at what was happening in Colorado and actually understand, with our energy resources, with our manufacturing base, with our fairly well-educated population, that we could actually see economic development that would happen as an impact or a consequence from changing the way we did energy policy. So it was about energy, environment, economic development. Those were the first 3 E's. But then, after I became governor, actually, I said, no, governors care a great deal about ratepayers, and we should. We have whole utility commissions that are there to regulate utilities, primarily because in the very early part of the 20th century, in 1905, the United States of America, the states, started taking the tack of regulating utilities because of the ability for those utilities to have a near monopoly. We had a lot of experience with monopolies, right, with railroad companies, and that was probably one of the most prominent. But even with telegraph companies, we understood sort of the need to regulate a variety of different kinds of activities where there was a public service, where there was often a common carrier, and where there was the ability to have something that approached a monopoly. And so we made a decision on the regulation side of that. And so a lot of that was about protecting the public and about protecting ratepayers. So we said the 4th E, that we would build out an energy policy that was about clean energy and economic development, but we're going to protect ratepayers. We're going to protect middle class and lower middle class and poor people, and we call that equity. That we were going to think about energy policy with respect to those 4 E's: energy, environment, economic development, and equity. And over the next 4 years, I signed 57 different pieces of legislation that we believed did just that. That looked at the energy portfolio in Colorado and said, what are the ways that we change this that respects the environment, but also can add or create jobs? So let's take the Renewable Energy Standard as an example. I won't go through all 57 bills. If anybody was concerned when they heard that I might now go through a menu of them. I'm just going to talk about a couple of examples, and we think probably one of the best stories we can tell is our Renewable Portfolio Standard. And what you need to understand in Colorado, we're an extractive industry state. So from the very beginning of the first discussions about renewable portfolio standards in the late 1990s, there has been serious opposition, and there have always been really big naysayers on the renewable energy side. And so it was debated in the legislature, in the State House, in the late 90s and the early part of the first decade of the millennium, and to no avail. We kept losing in committee. So a group of people said, we're putting this on the ballot. We're going to let the people of Colorado tell us whether or not they would like a renewable energy standard. We're not going to keep having this fight. It was like watching the same movie, and it kept ending the same way, and we didn't like the ending. So we went to the ballot, and the people of Colorado, in a fairly significant way, first state in the history of the United States of America's initiative measures, first state to put it on the ballot, passed a renewable energy standard on the ballot. Colorado did. 55-45, significant margin from an electoral perspective. And they said, yes, we want a renewable energy standard. It was 10%. The chief utility, XL, had opposed it, spent some money opposing it, and still the people said, no, we want it. We want a 10% renewable energy standard. Now, he said, how are we going to pay for that if it costs more for renewable energy? And one of the things that was in the measure was that every customer would pay a 50 cents a month surcharge. You could go into the legislature and change that, which XL did, went in and argued that it should be a 1% rate cap. So whatever you pay on your rate, you'd only pay 1% more of that for the renewable energy that they would have to produce by 2015. It had to be 10% of their whole portfolio. Well, there was such a subscription to renewable energy by Xcel customers that they understood then this is really what people want. This isn't some pie-in-the-sky dream that a bunch of legislators thought up. This is what people want. And so what happened was, as a candidate, we began talking about this new energy economy, said we're actually going to increase the renewable energy standard when I become governor. And I was elected in November of 2006. In January of 2007, we said one of the first things we're going to do that's a significant thing, we're going to go to a 20% renewable energy standard. We're going to go there by 2020, and we'll put in place a 2% rate cap. That was part of the negotiations. Meaning that in 2020, if your electricity bill would have been $100 using sort of the least cost resource, now it could only be $102, but Xcel had to ensure that 20% of that energy came from some renewable resource, which we defined pretty carefully in the bill, which actually excluded hydropower. Even though hydropower is a non-carbon resource, the environmental community was very concerned that the utilities that had hydropower in would do nothing but hydropower, and there's a real environmental consequence to building out more and more and more hydropower, when in fact you had access to wind and access to sun. Well, importantly in this discussion was this 2% rate cap, so we felt like we were actually protecting ratepayers in a pretty significant way. So that was 20% by 2020, a pretty aggressive standard at the time. So we go on in this conversation of the new energy economy. We keep signing bills. We do a variety of bills around metering and net metering. We allow the build out of transmission in a way that was different both by the investor-owned utilities but also the rural electric associations. They'd never had the ability to bond against future income to build out transmission. We gave them that. And those were the kinds of things we were doing to build up this ecosystem. We also saw some economic development after that 20%, but I'm going to come back to that. I want to go to what happened in 2010. By 2010, it was apparent we were actually going to get to our 20% standard way early. Maybe by 2015, maybe by 2016, but we were going to get there early, so we went back to the utility. Understand, this is still with all these naysayers who are out there telling us, this can't be done, you can't get there, it won't be that cheap, there's not enough energy to build it out. And we said, no, we believe there is. We went back to Xcel Energy. I went to the CEO, Dick Kelly, who was a clean energy guy, and said, we want to go to a 30% renewable energy standard, and we want to not change the date. We want to still do it by 2020, and we don't want to change the rate cap. Because we believe we can get to a 30% renewable energy standard in Colorado with a 2% rate cap, given that the price of both wind and actually solar PV as well had been dropping pretty precipitously. The utility agreed. So you have a major investor-owned utility who said we're on board to go to 30% by 2020 with the 2% rate cap. It's actually a great story because there were naysayers along the way. One of the chief naysayers in 2004 had been converted, Xcel Energy, and they had changed how they thought about this. This is really important to us and really important to this dialogue. Maybe one of the few states in the United States where they had utility company, a major utility, investor-owned utility, who really got sort of the power and the force of this argument. I think if you look at what Xcel's requirements are, they'll get to the 30% even before 2020. There's a very good chance of that. I should add that the 30% is not a true 30%. It's still very aggressive, and most states do things like this. Our 30% allows Xcel some credit for producing in-state. So that if it's produced in Colorado, then they get a little bit of that extra credit, and that extra credit adds to it to get to the 30%. But the fact of the matter is, Xcel has been, among utilities, one of the more gifted in understanding sort of the notion, one of the more enlightened about that. And so we're going to get to our 30%. We're probably going to get there before 2020. And other future policymakers could look at Colorado and decide we can expand our renewable energy standard even beyond that 30% by 2020. So that's part of the story. The interesting thing on the rate cap piece is people kept saying it's going to be too expensive. And fair play to people in 2004. They weren't forward-looking and probably didn't understand how price curves might come down with broader deployment. When I became governor, we had 275 megawatts of wind on the grid in Colorado. Right now, we're getting close to 2,000 megawatts. So 5.5 years later, we've gone from 275 from 2,000. A very significant build out. The price of wind when I became governor was something around 9.5, 10 cents a kilowatt hour. The last deal that was cut on wind was about 7 or 8 months ago. XL Energy bought 200 megawatts of wind from a company called Next Era, used to be Florida Power and Light, and they bought it for 3.2 cents a kilowatt hour with a thing called 50% capacity, meaning Next Era is saying we're going to produce wind at capacity from this wind farm 50% of the time for you here as as the purchaser of this power. But look at the price curve, right? 9.5 cents, 3.2 cents. That's 4 or 5 years later. Price curve coming. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them have to do with pure economics, with the supply chain in wind, but some of them just have to do with improved technology and the price coming down. So we have a 30% renewable energy standard. It's probably the third, what we used to say was the second most aggressive in the United States. And then I was presenting, and somebody from New York said they have the most aggressive. Somebody from California said they have the most aggressive. So I know we're second. I just don't know if we're second to California or New York. Maybe third. That's a joke. Anyway, so what we know is we're aggressive in that regard, but we basically had this policy that we've advanced in a pretty aggressive way, and over time proved the naysayers wrong about the kinds of arguments that they made with respect to renewable energy. As it relates to natural gas, this is this really important question. There's a lot of debate about natural gas, but I want to talk about that because we actually thought of natural gas as a part of a clean energy economy. And there are people certainly that may disagree with that, but let me tell you what we did. The starting point for us was not to transition from coal to natural gas. That was actually the punchline. That was something we did in 2010, my final year in office. We transitioned a gigawatt. By statute, we said, you've got to take a gigawatt of coal down by 2017, a very short timeline. We did that basically by saying you have to reduce the NOx by 70% by 2017, and there's a preference for gas because we'd already passed the 30% renewable energy standard. Preference was for gas. But the starting point was, as governor, in my first year, we passed 2 significant pieces of legislation with huge industry opposition. So when I became governor, the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission was made up of 7 members. And by statute, 4 of them had to be from industry. Now, I went to law school here, so I wasn't a math major, but 4 out of 7, the easy math on that was that you probably were going to get a set of regulations where they were going to be pretty friendly to the industry. And what we felt was that if we were going to be able to utilize natural gas as part of a clean energy solution, and we had to ensure that we were extracting it in an environmentally sound way. Really, we were the first state among the extracting states to go through our rules. First of all, we changed the makeup of the commission, 9 members, 3 from industry, but we added natural resources, public health and environment, Division of Wildlife, local government, royalty owners, and we came up with 9 members. And so a fair representation still from industry, but we also said these other concerns are really important. And then we said, you must write a set of rules that really are about all of these things that we believe are issues where we need to really ensure that we're doing this in an environmentally sound way. The second separate statute was a statute that said to that same commission, you need to write a set of rules that take into account wildlife. How can natural gas extraction coexist with wildlife issues or with wildlife, with habitat, with migration patterns, with minimal impact? And so we're going to do this. We're the first state in the country to have a set of rules that took into consideration wildlife, where we required companies to file comprehensive drilling plans that looked at wildlife issues and that cited their gas wells or oil wells in a way that did the minimal amount of impact to those habitats or to those migration patterns. So we did that, and it was really a significant fight. Pretty significant battle over a couple-year period, starting with the legislation, but then during the rule-making process, it was a big fight. Interestingly, we kept saying to the industry, listen, we don't want to put you out of business. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to ensure, actually, that in the 21st century you can survive because you're extracting the resource, whether it was oil or gas, in a way that was the most environmentally sensitive method available. There were a lot of things that they looked at and said, these are non-starters, and over time, we had a meeting of the minds where there were a couple of things that we did back off on a little bit, but things that we were aggressive in pursuing, and we came up with a set of rules that was the most strict set of rules at the time in 2008, by the end of 2008. We have since now changed and I think even improved upon the rules under my successor. Governor John Hickenlooper's administration got behind a rule of disclosure. So if you take all that was done in 2007, 2008, plus the disclosure rule, we probably have the best set of extraction rules of any state in the country. To call it the gold standard may be wrong, because I think the gold standard is still this ideal standard. And if you look at the International Energy Agency, it just did its sort of blueprint for the 21 things necessary in a set of extraction rules where you can really be guaranteed that you're doing it in the best fashion possible. And there may be still some things in Colorado that we can do to sort of improve upon what we already have in place, but we do, compared to other states, have this great set of rules. Because we put in this set of rules that we felt improved upon how we were handling air and emissions issues, how we were handling water issues, then we felt we could be comfortable in saying, now we're going to transition out of coal to natural gas. So we did that. We passed a bill, it was called the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, and actually you can imagine, there was great opposition from the coal industry, and actually opposition as well from labor. Because organized labor has a lot to do with how railroad trains are operated in the United States of America, and railroad trains wind up carrying a lot of coal. You also have United Mine Workers, coal workers. And so trying to sort of respect those workforce issues was one thing, but understanding that we had to have energy policy that was clean energy policy and that tied our energy issues back to emissions in the environment and air quality. We were helped a lot. It was interesting because right now, working with states, I've seen a lot of partisanship, where you're seeing sort of Republicans and Democrats square off over this issue around clean energy. And we did a lot of our things in a bipartisan fashion. One of the ways that Republicans were on board in 2010 when we wrote our Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, that was this transition out of coal to natural gas, is by saying, listen, the EPA has sent us this letter of non-compliance. And if we don't find a way to comply, we could be in a place where the EPA, the federal government's telling us how we produce our energy. And wouldn't it be better for us as Coloradans to decide how that looks? And so we did that. Anyway, those are two different stories that sort of tell the story of the clean energy economy. But not really the full story, because economic development actually became a part of the story of the new energy economy. Now remember, part of this, the second half of my time in office was really from the midway point to the end of it was the worst recession since the Great Depression. And so we saw economic development fall off generally in a really massive way. Colorado had had 25 straight quarters of growth right up until the day Wall Street cratered. In September of 2008, if Wall Street hadn't cratered the way it did, we likely would have had growth that quarter as well. But we didn't, because of just the big downturn that happened. We certainly didn't have quarter growth going forward, except for one sector. The clean energy, clean tech sector is the only sector that actually continued to grow during the downturn. We saw companies come in. Vestas, we attracted Vestas Wind Systems, the biggest turbine manufacturer, wind turbine manufacturer in the world, decided in America it was going to manufacture its turbines in Colorado. So it built 4 different plants. We have 1,600 Vestas workers working here, but then it required all of its suppliers to come to Colorado as well, and so we got to take advantage of the wind supply chain, not just one individual manufacturer. On the solar side, we've seen SMA Solar. It's a German company come in. They manufacture inverters. And they were looking around the United States, and they said, we're going to manufacture in Colorado. While I was governor, Colorado came from a place, I'm not sure exactly where we started. It's pretty low on the totem pole. We came to a place where we had the #1 number of solar workers per capita of anywhere in the United States. And our gross number was #2 only to California, which has a population 7 times the size of Colorado. And we've seen recently, some news stories about the bankruptcy of Abound Solar and GE deciding to wait before it decides whether or not it's going to build its cadmium telluride plant. And that's a lot to do with the price of panels coming down, which is good for consumers, but it has also some detriment to American manufacturers who are trying to compete with Chinese. And of course, there's this anti-dumping investigation for us to really see. The United States government is investigating whether China is actually dumping panels into the United States at a cost less than what it costs them to produce in order for them to capture the market. And they've actually found against the Chinese in May, and there will be final rules written on that. But this is this question about whether or not the Chinese were trying to capture the market, and quite frankly, the anti-dumping investigation, to the extent the Chinese are found to be dumping panels, that could be good for American manufacturers, but consumers have been able to take advantage of these low price panels that the Chinese have sent in, and that's had this bad impact on manufacturing. Still in Colorado, we're still #1 per capita if you look at the whole chain that involves research and development, manufacturing, and then installation as well. We passed a bill that said, you know what, it's kind of tough for everybody, especially middle-class folks, to afford that solar system and to pay, cash for a solar system. And so we said, what about third-party leases? California has that. Let's do third-party leasing, where a company comes in and they actually own the system, and you pay them a lease value, and they guarantee that that lease value, the rent value you pay on that, is actually going to be less than what you would be paying if you were paying your full energy bill. Well, 65% of all rooftop installations last year in Colorado were third-party leasing systems. So when we're working with other places around the country, we're saying, and we know there's a partisan argument about clean energy, but quite frankly, third-party leasing is something that could make a big difference in your state, and we don't think it's political. We don't think it's partisan. So third-party leasing is one of the things that we worked on. There was an idea that came out of Boulder that was called PACE financing. It was actually Boulder and Berkeley, which together had put these programs in place. It's stalled because of something that happened at the federal level, but it allows people to say, well, I pay a property tax. I'm going to voluntarily increase my property tax over a 20-year period. The county, which collects that property tax, can bond against that future income, and with that bond money, they can install energy efficiency or renewable energy systems on residents or on commercial buildings. So they can actually, you're paying for it by voluntarily increasing your property tax, but it gives you the ability to amortize that cost over a 20-year period. And of course, the liability on that property flows. You can still sell your property off, but the house still is going to take advantage of that. So you can actually have the next owner incur that same sort of obligation with that voluntary increase in property taxes. It's called PACE funding. We did it at the state, regional, and county levels, and there was a real appetite for it, but there was kind of a holdup because the FHA said, we don't want to be second. We don't want to take a secondary position to a voluntary increase in property taxes. In Congress, there's actually bipartisan support to say to the FHA, no, you will take that, the same as you would a regular property tax if it's a voluntary increase to do this, to build out these clean energy systems. So that was an important part of our thinking. And finally, I'll say energy efficiency was something that we also paid a great deal of attention to. And probably if you're thinking about how you build out this clean energy economy, it has a great potential for job creation and job growth, but it also probably has sort of the least amount of money spent on the greatest carbon savings. You look at the thing that's going to take your carbon footprint down the most. There's so much gain that we can make either by retrofitting the built environment or deciding as we go forward and building new buildings that we're going to do them in an energy efficient way. Now, there are added costs that are a part of that, but the cost of doing that are relatively low compared to the big pickup you have in carbon savings. So we in the state did a couple of things. We did demand side management with the utilities. So we said to Excel, we'll find a way to incentivize for you to have your customers use less. The big problems in America as we're trying to deal with having a smaller carbon footprint is looking at the utility model, the grand utility model, which has always been, if you create more power for more customers, we'll pay you more. You may have the same rate of return, but you just get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And we're saying all of a sudden to these utilities over the past 5 years, we'd like you to get smaller. We'd actually like you to produce less, and we want to incentivize your customers who you rely upon for rate payment, we want them to pay less to you. So we had to find ways to incentivize to do that. There's a couple different ways. There's one way that they call decoupling, but there's another way called demand-side management. There's no real way of saying which is better than the other, but the fact of the matter is it is important for us to look at utility models and say, how do we get people who pay electricity rates to actually decide they're going to save on their electricity bill by deploying a variety of things that require them to use less. There's smart grid technology that could be a part of that, and I argue will be a big part of it in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. That's all part of this clean energy economy. Colorado has been able to take advantage of so many different parts of it. And now the question is, will other states do that? There are other states that actually are doing a variety of really important things. And I think the big question is, will the federal government ultimately do it? Big battles at the federal level. We know that it's been politicized heavily in this election cycle. And so for our purposes, we're saying, what about after 2012, November 2012? Is there some group of Republicans and Democrats at the federal level, 60 different people in the United States Senate would have to probably agree on some kind of a strategy that's a clean energy strategy for us to have a national energy policy? I know. We know that we can do good things at the state level. There are 220 million people in America who live in a state that has either a renewable portfolio standard in law or a goal that they are trying to meet. There's 240 million that live in a state with an energy efficiency resource standard. So the states have done a great deal. The next big thing for us in the United States would be for us to have a national policy that really pays attention to carbon. So with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks and open it up to questions for the next 20 minutes or so. Is this new water? Thanks. Yes, sir.
So I've heard a lot of arguments about how hard it is to put renewables that are so variable onto a grid that's mainly coal-fired, and I know Colorado has a lot of traditional coal providing electricity. Do you know how that was working, getting so much renewable on, what agreements were made?
Well, first thing, if the rest of your grid is coal-fired, you shouldn't build out renewables. As long as they're intermittent. And right now, we live with intermittency. There's a great deal being done on the storage technology side, and we have some real hope that, particularly where solar is concerned, there's a variety of technologies, and there are people that have said to me, you give me 9 hours of sun right now, and I can give you 16 hours of power because of the storage technology we have. 16 is not 24, but it's 16. So, as long as it's intermittent, though, you should not cycle renewables with coal, because coal plants, by nature, or by construction, I guess, not by nature, but they're not meant to cycle. They actually emit more carbon cycling up. If you cycle them down to put wind and solar on, and you got to cycle them back up, there's huge emissions. You're better off running coal 24/7, no renewables, than cycling it down, cycling it up. The same is not true of gas. So the best technology, the best recent technology in gas-fired generation is there's really no emissions cost to cycling up versus running. You're in as good a position to cycle up and cycle down. So for our purposes, it's actually mixing gas and renewables that's one of the answers to this issue that has to do with how poor coal is at recycling. Ron Binns works with me now at the Center for the New Energy Economy. He was the chair of the Public Utilities Commission. He's been in Germany twice this past summer. He asked this question because Germany has this really massive deployment of renewables. It's like, what about the interconnection issues? And the Germans said, we just figured it out. We just figured it out. We just went after it, because we believed it was something that we needed to do. We haven't solved it all. We haven't solved all of the intermittency problems, but we're going to. And so it's one of those things where you hear that and say, gosh, this is really, going to be an insurmountable problem. And the fact of the matter is we're talking about engineering solutions, and Americans are the best, really, at surmounting those. The other thing I'll tell you, I went down to British Petroleum, to BP in Houston, at their Houston offices, and I was doing some work with them on regulatory schemes on natural gas extraction, but they have a whole wind division downtown. Built 2 wind plants up in the northern part of the state, close to the Wyoming border. I think it's called Cedar Creek. It's near Grover, Colorado, but Cedar Creek 1, Cedar Creek 2. So they have it all up on a screen, and they're monitoring the wind output. And I think together those two are about 500 megawatts. So a coal plant and a half, or 2 coal plants, and they're running at 98% capacity. And they said these are the 2 best wind farms in America right now, just because of the kind of wind they've generated. If you've ever been, in northern Colorado, southern Wyoming, and particularly in, November, December, January, February, wind blows. And it blows a lot. And so it's like we didn't have to cycle in intermittent, other kinds of power for a great deal of time out there because of the availability of this resource that was untapped in 2006. Yes, sir.
First, I would like to thank you for your talk. It was very motivational. My question is that you mentioned that already large companies have a contribution on renewable energy portfolio, such as producing or either by offering some services like leasing. I would like to know your recommendation or advices for startups or very small companies. How can they contribute to the renewable energy portfolio?
So the questions about startups and very small companies, and I have to say that actually Colorado is probably a place that's as good as almost any, perhaps with the exception of maybe Northern California, because of Silicon Valley, because of the availability of capital for very small startups and how they've built sort of this ecosystem. We do a pretty good job here. And what I would say is, first of all, finding the kind of capital necessary to get you sort of out of the laboratory and all the way through to true commercialization is a difficult task. So I'm not minimizing how all the barriers that might exist, and particularly barriers that exist right now, sort of while we're still in this sluggish place in our economy, and where there's real question about whether we as a nation want to develop a clean energy economy. But I'd say the way to do it is, as much as you can, get advice from people who have done startups. We have a group called TechStars. They're more about information and technology kinds of companies, but it is about how you transform a startup into a going concern. The TechStars group, and they were out of this law school, I think initially. It was Dean Weiser, who's now the dean of the law school there, and a guy named Brad Feld, who were the co-founders, right, Mike? And so part of it is being mentored through that process. Of course, you have to have a technology, right, that's new and different and that works, but then you have to have mentors and you have to have capital and you have to have policymakers who are willing to try and think of ways to help you. If you have a sense for how you could be financed in a way that would assist you, then you should talk to people who are still in public policy and say, these are the kinds of things we need. One of the things we're doing at the center that I run at Colorado State University is asking the question, what would be the template for states to put clean energy financing in place? And in some places, like Connecticut, they have a green fund that has part of it devoted to startups. We had that for a time here in Colorado. With the downturn, a lot of it has gone away. What we're thinking is, let's turn that on its head and say, we keep saying, let's start with state funding and that'll attract institutional capital. We're saying, no, let's see if we can't get the institutional capital interested and then have state as the match, or state managing the loan loss reserve. So we think finance is a really big part of it. But these are all sort of broad answers to a pretty specific question, which is how do you do this? And the answer is, I would absolutely seek out mentors in this, and then particularly try and find people who have raised that capital that got companies through what's commonly known as the death valley, the place where they lose capital because they haven't gotten to complete commercialization and there's nowhere for them to turn.
Thank you.
This is
You, sir, and Anthony Reed.
I just have two quick questions. So the first one is that when the policymakers change on sort of the federal level, then how does that affect these sort of standards that states set for their own use of things? And the second question is that when they do set this standard and they don't meet it, let's say, then what happens? Is there some sort of a thing that you have to maintain it, or you have to do something like that?
Well, so the assumption sort of is, if you set a renewable energy standard, a utility does not make that, they're regulated by a Public Utilities Commission that can impose a variety of different requirements or restrictions, or even something that might amount to a penalty. It may not be set in statute. In most places it's actually not what the ramification is, but it is, you're in this regulated market. And we know there are states that are actually, I think, in jeopardy of not being able to meet their standard. So that's your second question. The first question is, what happens at the federal level? Well, I think that, quite frankly, we probably will not have a renewable energy standard at the federal level because there are too many states that argue they have a difficult time meeting a renewable energy standard because they have, too little availability of what we might consider renewable resources. So remember, I don't know if you heard it or not, but President Obama made a State of the State speech in 2010. And in that speech, the president, was it 2000? No, it was 2011. In that speech, he didn't talk about a renewable energy standard, a renewable portfolio standard. He talked about a low carbon standard. It was really a nod to the people who had been saying, we don't want just renewables, we want nuclear included in that, and we want natural gas to be part of a low energy standard. If you take care of these extraction issues that there are with natural gas around methane, and even some with respect to water, there are some other kinds of extraction issues that they have to address, but if they address those, when you burn natural gas, 70 to 80% less NOx, 70 to 80% less SOx, 50% less carbon, still carbon, 50%, you eliminate the mercury. So to think about it in terms of a low carbon standard or a cleaner carbon standard, natural gas can play a part of it. Nuclear is zero carbon, right? So Southern Power Company is the one company that's now permitted 2 nuclear facilities. And it really, in recent times, nobody else has permitted nuclear. But in the South and the Southeast, they're big fans of it. So if you look at low carbon, instead of just renewable, then you have this thing that I think every region in the country has a vision how they could play in a clean energy standard and not just a renewable.
Can I ask for, I got 2 things tied to that. That southern, all those reactors in the South, they have it in state law that the utility can collect in advance the cost of these reactors from the ratepayers. So the ratepayers are paying now for those reactors. How do you see that as something that could propagate? And the other question is, well, we don't have a national energy policy, we have national incentives like the PTC and the ITCs. How do you see that for all the energy industries? How do you see those incentives playing out through this next year of transition of Congress and administration and all that?
So let's again start with the second question first, because the PTC is the production tax credit. It's worth 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour. It's been very valuable to people who have planned wind farms around the country, and it's set to expire at the end of this year. So whether you like it or not, we've used fiscal policy, tax policy, to try and create manufacturing and actually, the build out of an industry. It's quite successful with the wind industry, except it's come and gone a few times over its history, and every time it's going to go away, you see a waning effect in the build out of wind. There's no wind farm producer right now planning a new wind farm. And in many respects, like I said, 3.2 cents a kilowatt hour, that's pretty cheap power. Why wouldn't you just go ahead and build out wind farms at that price? Well, the wind farm producers would say, even if some places in this country, we can go toe-to-toe with coal on the build-out of wind, for the levelized cost of the energy, we don't want to miss that production tax credit if it comes back. So we're going to wait and see if it comes back. And in the meantime, this thing has just died. It's just completely dead. The investment tax credit is a tax credit that you're more likely to take advantage of with respect to the build-out of solar. So it doesn't sunset until 2014 or 2015, and I think that's why we still see, even without a complete national energy policy, we still see people who've been taking advantage of the investment tax credit. In ARA funding, the Recovery Act funding, they said there was a method for us to do grants in lieu of that because people didn't need a tax credit, they weren't earning income, they weren't paying income tax, and so they preferred just cash grants. And there was great use made of the 1603 program that was cash granting. And so, I mean, that's been an important part of it. Should we there have been some candidates that have suggested, let's wipe out every subsidy that exists. And first of all, it's not going to happen. There really exist significant subsidies for the fossil fuel industries. So if anybody could ever, convince the fossil fuel industries to give up very significant subsidies, I think others might consider backing off. The wind industry has said we don't need a subsidy more than 4 years. 3 or 4 years, we've seen the price come down, technology get better, we can go toe-to-toe, maybe not with $2.50 gas, but we can go toe-to-toe with $4 gas, and we think that's likely what it's going to be in 2014, 2015. Solar is still at this place where we've seen the technology get better, the price come down, but still they're not at sort of what I call grid parity, where they can go toe-to-toe with coal. They certainly can't go toe-to-toe with gas, and so they need this subsidy to help continue to build out this industry. And I think for industries like that, we have to make a conscious decision. But I do think solar and storage technology around solar is absolutely a part of our getting to 80% reductions in emissions by 2050. So I would encourage us to continue to think about the role that subsidies play in allowing us to again, have environmental and climate policy that's part of how we think about energy production. Your first question, is it fair for ratepayers now to pay out the cost of future nuclear? And I'd say absolutely not. Think of this again from the equity perspective. There are a lot of people who are on fixed incomes who are paying certain rates, and when they pay their energy bill, there may be other things that they're not really able to pay. And so now you have a 75-year-old person paying for nuclear energy that's going to come on the grid in 20 or 25 years. That doesn't seem to me like it's all that fair. And one of the things about nuclear that I should say, there's still some fans of nuclear, and we see the permitting of 2 new plants. It still is definitely part of our energy strategy. It provides about 20% of all the energy to the United States. It provides 50% of the energy in Illinois. As a state, they made a bet on nuclear. Now they've got to figure out kind of what the next thing they do is. But if you think about this from the emissions perspective, if you're back to thinking, how do we address environmental issues by changing our energy portfolio, nuclear is a very slow way to do it. The kind of build-out we're talking about of nuclear, pretty expensive, first of all, and secondly, with all the permitting, the siting issues, and then in the building of it, and then the testing of it. It's a 2 to 3 year process to test these nuclear facilities at the scale that we currently have built them. There are people that talk about modular nuclear, where it's smaller, easier to build out, easier to permit, easier to test. We haven't done that, quite frankly, but if you think about how we have nuclear now, it's not a real solution to our reducing our emissions by 2020 or 2025. It might be a 2030, 2035 solution, but it's a pretty expensive one. You had a question?
Back again.
This woman had a question, and then the gentleman in the white t-shirt.
Can you point out the main obstacles why there's not a federal policy on this? I mean, I don't understand that from a country that's been arguing about the details for the last 20 years and not about if there should be a policy or not. So I just don't get why there's no federal policy on this whole issue.
So that's a great question. There was actually some level of agreement among Democrats and Republicans 8 years ago, or 6 years ago. In 2006 when I was running for office, it was less politicized. But there are still significant incumbents, right? So the coal industry is a significant incumbent. And even among utilities that have sort of, they have a lot of infrastructure that relies on coal, utilities by nature are not agents of change. They're not going to go to the Congress and say, we want something different in the United States of America, and we want a federal policy to do it. There are individuals who run utilities who are enlightened and are thinking this is what we have to do, but as a broad industry. And so it really is going to be incumbent upon Congress to sort of take on those incumbents and say, we need something new, we need something different. What happened in 2008 is the president got elected. He had sort of this vision around clean energy. He put a variety of clean energy measures into the stimulus funding, and there was party opposition. There was partisan opposition. The Republicans started talking about the stimulus bill as a failed measure, and the president as a failed president within 6 months. I was testifying in front of a Senate committee. It was the Senate Committee for Environment and Public Works, and had senators, and I'm working with Republican governors, by the way, across the country, and find some success in working with Republican governors, but we've seen in Congress the politicization of this energy issue in an effort to defeat the president and to defeat the president's party. And I think that's what's happened over the last few years. The president spent a lot of political capital. When you're in elective office, it's like you have a bank account that we'll call political capital. You have a certain amount to spend. And the president spent a lot of it passing the Stimulus Act in the first month of his presidency. He spent really a great deal of it, some might say the rest of it, in the next year passing health care. So why didn't he pass an energy bill first? Because his base really believed in the health care issue as fundamental to his narrative for becoming president. And he, I think, believed, his administration did, he had to do health care next. So he really spent all of his political capital, and then the 2010 elections were a big backlash against the president. And in part, there was this narrative around clean energy and the politicization of it, and now you're just stalled until we figure out who's going to be the next president and which parties control the House and the Senate. And I think, as well, there's going to have to be a reckoning with science. The biggest problem I have in this whole conversation, I think the Republicans have a great deal about many ideas that are important for us as a country to really, address debt reduction, deficit reduction. The problem is there's a number of people in policy-making positions in this country who've turned what I consider to be a blind eye on science. And that's partly why this conversation's been able to stall, is because they're disregarding it. Yes, sir, in the white t-shirt right here.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering if you could go back to the leasing program. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, and like as a homeowner, how you get involved in that, and why anybody wouldn't. Like you said that it would be cheaper per month than just paying your utility bill. So like, why don't I see every solar on every house in Boulder?
Because not all houses are constructed in a fashion that can take advantage of it. Split dormers facing west, I mean,
oh, right.
that kind of a thing. And so the original concept around building the house, nobody was sort of thinking through where we're going to get maximum exposure, and can we ensure that there's really a plane where you can build out solar. So I'd say that that's probably one of the reasons. Other people may just not have an appetite to build out solar, although in Boulder you would think that there would be significant build out of it. And so that's probably it. You can contact, and there are two different ones, and I don't want to just contact the third-party leasing, and after this I'll tell you what I think of the two different companies. There may be more, but I don't want to say it publicly and get in trouble with one or the other because I didn't mention them. But if you're a homeowner and want to investigate that, you ought to do that. We also have these solar gardens for people who rent but would like solar power. So we passed a bill and said you can build out, an array. Holy Cross Energy is a rural electric association. It's doing its third one of these. They build out a big array of solar, and then they actually go to their customers and say, you want to buy some panels and not have to put them on your rooftop? You buy those panels, and whatever they produce will reduce your energy bill virtually. And then they can show kind of when the payback will come. But in the meantime, you get the sense, right, that you're producing solar, you own solar, and you're reducing your electric bill as part of it. Yes?
My question is regarding the role of renewable energy as an economic driver, as an engine for essentially reducing the unemployment rate. The question is, does that come largely or necessarily from manufacturing or from implementation? And in particular, I'm thinking about solar photovoltaic. As an example, would it be okay for all the panels that come from China, we use them and build up infrastructure and so on, or do we need to make them here?
First of all, let's talk about manufacturing, because panels, are made up of component parts. The United States of America was a net exporter of the components. If you look at what we exported and then what we imported, we were actually a net exporter in solar in 2010. I haven't seen sort of the figures on 2011. I suspect we weren't a total net exporter, but we're not a total loser in the sort of manufacturing issue. In the job creation part of it, solar manufacturing largely around the world is not very labor intensive. If you've ever been, and one of the things the Chinese do, they build this stuff to scale. You can stand on one end of a solar manufacturing plant and not be able to see the other end. You know, and it's Chinese-owned land, often Chinese-owned companies, Chinese state enterprises, state-owned enterprises. So, you know, they can do this thing at this grand scale. But the fact of the matter is, it's very robotic. If you looked at, I was through Abound Solar's manufacturing floor, and a lot of that's going to be done not with human labor, but really with robotics. So you don't necessarily lose a lot in the way of job creation by jobs going to China, but we'd like to, I mean, you still as a governor, you care a great deal about job creation. It is this installation, where solar is concerned, it's installation that matters a great deal, and to build out, you know, a workforce that can install either the concentrated solar power plants, the massive PV solar arrays, or do rooftop installation. Anybody know what a feed-in tariff is? So there are a bunch of different, now it's called Clean Local Energy Access Now, where a group of people in a municipality would all have a purchase power agreement where they would have rooftop solar, businesses or residences, and they would sell that to the power purchaser, who in turn provides power back to the community, and you might have some kind of a tariff for it. Spain and Germany had sort of famous for this, but this is this place. If you did that in a municipality, and you had a 4 megawatt feed-in tariff in a municipality the size of Boulder, or you know, Fort Collins, there's a lot of people that are going to go to work installing solar as a part of that.
Any more questions? Another one.
Yeah, with respect to the standards you put in place for natural gas extraction, I'm just wondering what you thought was one of like your wins or something that you got in there, and one or two that you didn't get in that you really like pushed in.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm famous for answering the second question last. First, the one that we didn't get in but got in, which was good. Because remember, we were the first state modernizing our rules, and so we want full disclosure of fracking fluids going into the ground. We agreed that there might be something in the way of trade secret protection, but we want disclosure. The industry said we've done all these other things, so it's a bridge too far for us to actually do that disclosure. But you know what? We passed that regulation last November, and while there's still trade secret protections, you can go into Frac Focus and you can look at how many times companies are utilizing the trade secret protection. I think it's fewer than 10% of the time. So 90-some% of the time, we've got full disclosure of the fracking fluid going into the ground. We think that was, for our part, disappointing not to have gotten it back in 2008. Good that we have it now. It was amazing to me the things we didn't have in 2007. We didn't have pit lining rules. We're bringing fracking fluid and processed water out of the ground without pit lining rules. We had no well completion rules, and so we passed a series of well completion rules and said, you know, you got to start doing that in 2009. When the EPA recently passed its green well completion rules and said to the producers, they said, we're going to give you 3 years till I think 2014 or mid-2014, 2015. We're going to give you that in order to, you know, do all this necessary to transition to well completion. The producers in Colorado have to do nothing to meet the EPA rule in 2015 because of what we did in 2008 that they had to begin doing in 2009. I would say also the wildlife protection was a big part of it. I think nobody else had sort of thought about this way. We had seen in the state of Wyoming actual migration patterns of mule deer end when the production in Pinedale, Wyoming really grew pretty significantly. So we worked with a lot of wildlife groups to think about this. The other thing we didn't do, but it really wasn't as big an issue as it is now, that we're going to have to deal with as a state, and I would say this is as a country, is this interface between gas production and communities. We've now seen Loveland has a moratorium in place. Fort Collins is considered a moratorium. Boulder has a moratorium in place. Longmont has a moratorium that is on the ballot, scheduled for a vote in November. The Attorney General's office has sued Longmont and said you can't, as a local entity, put a moratorium in place. We're going to have to figure this out. And the governor put together a panel. They made some recommendations, and I like the recommendations. I actually think we're going to have to probably go a little bit further to get to a place where we resolve this, and resolve it in favor of a great quality of life for people who happen to be living, you know, over a gas plant or near it. Well, thanks. One more.
Just one more. I was going to ask, I know that the
Have what?
So I know that the Chinese seem to have a price advantage in terms of manufacturing the solar panels, but also when you think about it, the US government has certain aid agreements in place for energy for developing countries. Now, are there any mechanisms that allow the manufacturers of solar panels in the US to take advantage of this in terms of export?
Right, you know, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry I don't, but, so could the United States allow United States manufacturers to take advantage of agreements that they have in place for the purposes of solar exports? And I don't know. You know, I lived in Zambia for 3 years, from 1987 to 1990, and this is a place where largely the electricity, there was one line where we live in the Western Province. It came from Victoria Falls. The power was out probably 25% of the time for a variety of reasons. It had to do mostly with the management of the transmission, and so we relied very heavily on diesel generators. And, you know, for backup power, talk about a carbon footprint, diesel generators. And so distributed generation is what we call distributed generation, right? Small scale, sort of not utility scale, but small scale power generation. So think whether it's a small concentrated solar plant or rooftop solar, or maybe it's a small wind farm or things like that. We defined it in our bills in Colorado as 30 megawatts or less. It's really the answer for the developing world. And the price is going to have to probably come down a little bit more for the developing world to fully utilize it, unless there's assistance from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. But there's 1.3 billion people in the world that have no access to electricity in their home. And we think distributed generation is a part of that. I don't know the answer about United States exports, but what I do know is there are places where they could make great use of even without storage technology, of distributed generation power.
I wanted to say a little something about ICAMP so you can kind of understand this audience. This is an intercontinental school, and it rotates around the globe every summer. There's a different topic in a different place. Where's the next one?
England.
Is it England?
Yeah, or England and Scotland.
And we're
The
thinking,
UK.
Yeah.
also thinking of taking this particular school and duplicating it in either India or China,
Yeah.
and sponsored by their academies of sciences. But most of these students are from various places around the world. What is it, 29 countries that are? 36?
Did I speak too fast?
Most of these,
American disease.
these are very, very sharp students. So when you get the quizzical question about why in the hell can't you people figure this out, that was from our German student.
I understand. I understand the question. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's
That was wonderful.
been my pleasure. Thanks very much.